I'm James Hughes, bioethicist and resident techno-progressive.
And I'm Eisikovits, philosopher and resident Luddite.
And you're listening to Prosthetic Gods, an optimist and a grump on tech, a podcast where we explore the social, ethical, and political impacts of emerging technologies. Well, Brother Near.
Hello.
Welcome to Midnight in America.
I know. Midnight in America, indeed. Darkness at noon.
Well, we picked a great topic for the beginning of the year, and that is death. We want to talk about our feelings about death, and I have lots of thoughts, as you do.
There you go. Avoiding death.
Yes. I take 2 handfuls of pills each day, one in the morning, one in the evening, to ward off as my magical talisman death, all kinds of different little things that are supposed to keep my brain healthy and whatnot. I exercise every day, but I have to say that my interest in anti-aging therapies abated after some early experimentation because the evidence still is slowly accumulating. But I do think that we're close. I think we're close to being able to have some really effective anti-aging therapies, and I'll bring up Ozempic later as an example.
So you're taking your pills as just wishful thinking?
Well, I don't know if it's wishful. It probably will add a couple days to my life, but I mean, all the evidence is that daily exercise, keeping a good weight, having friends.
Having friends is a big one.
Yeah, and that's the one I definitely need to work on. But those things are bigger predictors, and wealth is a bigger predictor of longevity.
Yeah, you have your Luddite friend, but I think he's making your life shorter rather than longer.
Yes.
So are we talking about death, or are we talking about avoiding death through life extension?
Well, we'll get to the term immortality, which I hate. I don't think that the goal should be ever discussed as immortality for various reasons. And the goal for me, as I've said before, is just that I think people should be able to choose when they die. And I think we might eventually get to that point where death is more or less a choice for most people. But in the short term, I think it's kind of a consequentialist goal that I want people to have as much healthy life expectancy as possible, and that would make us all happier.
So you mean people should completely be able to choose when they die, because they can already choose when they die?
Yeah, no, I mean
suicide.
Most deaths are involuntary. So, yeah, I want all the involuntary death to go away and it just to be the voluntary death, which freaks people out as well, the idea that everyone would choose suicide eventually. We'll get there. So the first, there are a variety of objections that we decided to work through with this article. And the first one that I get all the time and that I relish as a lefty is who has access to life extension, and is it a form of injustice to invest in the research or the therapies to keep people alive longer when there are lots of other social things. So I'll let you take that one first. How do you feel about that objection?
Let me ask you if it's okay just to step one step back so that we get all of our listeners on the same page. Broadly, what are we talking about in very broad strokes when we're talking about life extension technologies? Like what's here now and what's coming soon?
Well, if you talk to my buddy Aubrey de Grey, who pioneered what he called strategies for engineered negligible senescence. He and his group.
Does he know what that means?
Well, yeah. It's an you can Google it, but it's basically 7 aging processes. The buildup of sugars in your cells and this and that. And if we could fix each of those things and reverse them, then we would have at least anti-aging, if not reversal of aging. That's the kind of dominant paradigm for transhumanists to think about this thing. But if you talk to biogerontologists like Jay Olshansky, who I have worked with in the past on what he calls the longevity dividend, they have much more modest goals of using drugs and devices that could slow down the aging process and potentially give us a decade or 2 more healthy longevity. And so I think, between those two, it depends on how optimistic you are, but at least a couple more decades, if not
Yeah, so everything from the slowing down of the intentional slowing down of degenerative processes to manipulating our metabolism to, stuff like you said, like Ozempic. So a sort of cocktail of technologies, most of which are sort of already in play to some extent for reversing the aging process or significantly slowing it down.
Yeah, I think the biggest dividends there will come from things like vaccines that counteract various processes in the body, or therapies that do that. There also are the replacement of organs, so that, the cloning of organs, mechanical organs that could add some years of life. But Jay Olshansky has pointed out that if we were to cure cancer, heart disease, and stroke, the three leading causes of death, we would only add about 5 or 6 years of life expectancy, because after that, people start to die from dementia and things like that. So you really need to address the underlying pathogenic process, which is aging itself, and declare aging to be the disease process.
Yeah, so the project is curing aging and essentially removing the top limit from life expectancy. Indefinite.
Exactly. Yes. Okay. That's
a
long-term goal. The short-term goal, which, the most conservative biogerontologists do, attest that they think we could add another decade or two. So in the medium term, that.
All right. So my dear friend Jay Hughes is declaring death on death, or declaring death to death.
Death to death.
Yeah, there you go. But let's keep the sort of darker existential questions for later, because this is one of those rare topics that we have a pretty broad range of agreement about and a somewhat narrower range of disagreement. So there's a bunch of objections, like you said, to indefinitely reversing the aging process and to taking off the top limit, as it were. So the first one that you started mentioning was the question of access. Like all technologies, the objection would go, there would be unequal access to these technologies. Rich people would live to be 150. The rest of us would, keep dying at 75 or 80. And that would be a problem of justice. So what's your take on that objection?
Well, I've been an advocate for universal health care since I was a teenager, and I still think that that is the answer. Every other industrialized country is going to decide which of these longevity therapies they're going to include in their universal health care coverage and which they're not. And I think that's an important question. There will be some that will be too expensive or experimental or marginal benefit to include, and others that will meet that threshold. So unfortunately, in the United States, because we have this fragmented system, yes, there's going to be, as there are with all healthcare and already with life expectancy, a correlation of wealth to longevity, because poor people have the worst of everything, and including not having health insurance when they need it or not using it the way they could. So I think we should have universal healthcare. But that is, I have always attested that if we had effective anti-aging therapies, it would be one of the most popular things that everybody would want. And I think Ozempic is a great example. There are estimates now that if everyone who is obese or has diabetes could get access to GLP-1 drugs, and they're rapidly improving as well, like oral formulations instead of the shots, that we could save a million lives in the United States a year from the diseases that are correlated with that. So that's just a small example. It's not addressing the underlying aging process. It's just addressing obesity, which is one of the principal things that is a drag on American and European life expectancy.
Right. So broadly, our answer to this objection, to this idea that when these technologies come online, they will be unequally distributed, is that that's true pretty much of every technology that comes online, and that's a public policy rather than a technology issue. That's right. That we need to come up with public policies.
When AIDS was started ravaging us, and the antiretroviral therapies became available, they cost $40,000 a pop. And no one said in the United States that folks who had HIV should not take these drugs because they weren't yet accessible in the developing world or across the United States. We said, how can we get these drugs cheaper so that everyone can have access to them? We set up an international consortium to support access to antiretroviral drugs in Africa for sub-Saharan people. India, Brazil, other countries said that we're just going to start making it and giving it to people if you don't allow us to buy it at a cheaper rate. So we're going to have those fights. We're going to have those fights about every anti-aging therapy that's expensive.
That's actually a really interesting example because I think it highlights one of the problems here. That happened with AIDS because AIDS was seen as a crisis. It's going to be harder to convince people that the mere fact of dying of old age is a crisis. That's a transhumanist sort of belief. So in some ways, it's a political mountain that you have to climb there.
Well, my buddy Nick Bostrom, he wrote an essay 20 years ago called The Fable of the Dragon Tyrant, which
I remember that.
It's basically about when do we reach the tipping point when people realize, wait a minute, people don't have to die anymore. Yeah. and we start doing what we need to do. We will reach that tipping point eventually. I think the wide popularity of Ozempic is an example that people have objections to fat pills. And then a fat pill comes along and they're like, actually, sounds like a pretty good idea. Not only does it reduce your likelihood of dying of obesity, but it reduces alcohol abuse, it reduces cannabis use. Everything that people might think was a vice is reduced by Ozempic. So.
Okay. The second objection that often comes up is the quality versus quantity concern. And the idea here is, why the hell would you want to add another 20, 30, 40 years, which would be spent in misery and decrepitude under very unpleasant conditions? This is not a numbers game. It's a quality game.
When I wrote Citizen Cyborg 20 years ago, and a piece of that argument that I made was that we should adopt the quality or quality adjusted life year as a metric for assessing whether human enhancement technologies and life extension in particular was a benefit. If you remember, a quality says over the course of X year, you have a maximum of 1 health. And if you're sick, you have less than that. And we're going to try to quantify how many extra years of health we add within any intervention. If something were to extend your life by 10 years, even if it was at a lower rate of quality, it could still be considered a benefit. So most people's anxiety about this is what we call the Tithonus objection, which is, I don't want to be sick a lot longer. Tithonus was a Greek guy who fell in love with a goddess. She granted him eternal life, but forgot to grant him eternal health, and he eventually becomes a cricket, and she has to carry him around in a bucket. So we don't want to become like Tithonus. We all agree. So the way we measure that in health policy research is with the quality, and then also with the disability adjusted life year, which is how many years do people spend sick. We want to minimize that and maximize qualities. And I think that approach argues on behalf of healthy life expectancy. But yes, if we came up with a therapy where everyone had to be in an iron lung for the last 20 years of their life, then we could talk about the quality of life being so low that the cost of the intervention is not worth it. But that's not what we're talking about.
No. And I also think that it's important to remember that quality is not a fixed variable. So one's expectations of quality of life change over the lifespan. So, that's already true in middle age.
In general, seniors are happier than younger people because they have certain kinds of wisdom that they've hard accrued. But then when you get to very disabled states, in your 80s and your 90s, yes, there's you start to lose friends and there's some depression and so forth. But still, most seniors do not kill themselves. Right?
Yeah.
There may be a little more depression to deal with when you're 80s and 90s, but it's still life worth living, according to most seniors.
Yeah, and specifically as we age, it seems to me that we accept more decline in our quality of life as normal and as something that is still okay to live side by side with. It's a little bit like the research about the connection between money and well-being and happiness. There's probably a tipping point after which you no longer think that, you're living at an acceptable quality. But just to talk about, quality as if it was a fixed variable is silly because, you are fine once you're, say, 50 with all kinds of declines in memory and in muscle mass and speed and cognitive processing, et cetera, and you just sort of think about it as you don't necessarily think about those as a punishing sort of deterioration in the quality of your life, but rather as part of the normal process.
And the longer our life expectancy gets, the more people adapt to not disengaging from life at the end of life. A big recent study just looked at people who were born from like 1910 to 1950s. And for every decade of seniors, at the same age, seniors are getting healthier. So the rates of senior disability have been declining. And part of that is just our social expectations about 80 being the new 60. And people live up to that. They're more active, they're more engaged, So I think that's great. And let's just push it.
But if one does take your Matrix and Citizen Cyborg seriously and the sort of quality and quantity relationship seriously, it does suggest that part of the investment in anti-aging technologies, for example, has to be in mental health technology. It can't just be, and it hasn't been at all. There's been no breakthroughs in mental health technology since for 30 years, since SSRIs. Now they're starting a little bit with I was just reading today that there's a promising new startup out of Israel that is solving the TMS issue to make it a lot more, the sort of cranial stimulation technologies to make them a lot more promising and so on and so forth. But mental health technology certainly seems to be lagging behind physical health technology.
Well, SSRIs are an interesting case because they were overhyped and there was publication censorship and all kinds of problems. But, I live in the science hype literature, so I'm constantly seeing new advances. But even if you discount, SSRIs as a way to treat senior depression or something like that, I think we're going to have a bunch of new things. Psychedelics, we already have approved psychedelic therapies for dealing with anxiety about dying. We already have BCIs that allow people to communicate in the locked-in state, where people would have in the past said, I think I'll just rather die than not being able to communicate with anybody ever again.
Right. I just think if this is a policy issue, that needs to be a policy concentration, namely to have the mental health anti-aging, as it were, catch up with the physical health anti-aging.
Well, we as a society, we have overinvested in medical specialties, but one of the medical specialties we've underinvested in because it's not terribly lucrative is geriatrics. And I think every geriatrician is trained in how to identify and treat senior depression or whatever. So I do think it should be given more attention. Absolutely. But I can't believe that we'll be in a future where we'll be able, this gets back to the Gattaca problem. It's like you're in a future where you can tweak every kid's DNA, but you can't fix somebody's heart. Are we going to be in a future where people can live to 120, but we don't know how to fix a broken brain? I doubt it. I think we're going to figure those things out.
Yeah. And it seems like the main thing that you're going to have to figure out with the extension of the lifespan, if you're going to want to have quality keep up with quantity, is dementia.
Yes, and I think we are making progress with both preventing and treating dementia. It's not as quick as anyone would like, but the tau plaques we're figuring out how to erase them from the brain, or whether they're viral elements that lead to, there may be multiple kinds of dementia that we have to address. Multi-infarct dementia is mostly a result of alcoholism, for instance, as opposed to Alzheimer's disease. So, I think all of the different kinds of neurodegenerative diseases. By the way, cannabis turns out to be anti-inflammatory and neuroprotective. So it's one of the advantages. Seniors who take cannabis have a slower onset of dementia.
There you go. You told me so, right?
I was very pleased to find that
out. Let's go to a more interesting objection, actually. If you do extend the lifespan, you would be increasing the relative political power of old people.
Well, it's hard not to take that seriously right now with this Congress and Supreme Court and papacy or whatever you look at.
Yeah.
I do take the gerontocracy problem seriously, but I think there's a couple dimensions to it. One is that an older society would be better in some ways. It would be probably a less violent society. Now, the link between individual violence and social violence is perhaps tenuous. It may be that seniors would be quite happy to send young soldiers to die if they're not the ones who are going to die.
That's the history of war right there.
The history of war. But they are less likely to kill other people. So that's good. They consume less. They give more. I think there's, they're happier. So I think there's some advantages to an older society, even if we have gerontocracy. But the problem I see is that because of the growth of gerontocratic power in the United States, we have this debate about, well, can we ever tweak Social Security, Medicare, retirement ages, any of those things? And across the world, people are trying to raise retirement ages and finding it difficult. And that's a problem because the constituency for early childhood education, or the constituency for universal health care for young parents, or whatever policy you imagine that addresses the other end of the life spectrum, those are much weaker because they don't have the political constituency. So I do think we need to seriously address this. But really, is it that difficult to make an argument to seniors that it would be a better society for them if young people were well educated and healthy and maybe had the social supports they need to start families? I think that that's a pretty easy argument to make, especially since old people generally are connected to young people somehow.
Yeah, on the one hand. On the other hand, concretely, you could see old people hesitating even more to move out of jobs that they otherwise would have vacated for young people if they're doing very well. And then you have institutions sort of becoming potentially more staid, although if the old turn out to be on your plan a lot more vigorous than they otherwise would have been, then the institutions maybe would have, stay more vital. But you have less turnover in places like universities or in places like, leadership positions in the private and the public sector. So that's one sort of concrete concern. I think the bigger philosophical concern is that gerontocracies can be exponentially self-perpetuating in the sense that old people are around for longer, have more resources, in some ways fewer expenses, can lobby more powerfully for the interests of old people, and so sort of end up exponentially increasing their power.
Well, for what it's worth, economists, I believe, see that the baby boomers in the United States are transferring a lot more wealth to their children than was expected. So I think there are those intergenerational transfers. But let me throw another log on this fire, which is that I've been promoting a concept that Jay Olshansky, the gerontologist, came up with 2 decades ago, called the longevity dividend. It's an argument that the principal costs of seniors to society come from their medical and care costs. A senior in nursing care, $40,000, $50,000, $60,000 a year, not to mention home care. And if you could keep them healthy, you could at least keep them from using those resources, and they could possibly participate in the labor market in some way. Now, I also think that the automation of jobs is a part of this picture, and it may be that there are no jobs. You raise the retirement age and say, okay, 67-year-old, you need to go out and find a job. And there are no jobs because they've all been eaten by robots. But at any rate, if we could keep their costs down, it would be a boon to the social welfare state. And I think that that's an argument that young people could probably get behind.
Yeah. And we should say, even though it's a little bit corny, that if we take this seriously, you get a wisdom dividend. Namely, if old people are in good shape and around for longer, you get to benefit from their life experience for longer.
God, I hope that's true. I mean, I don't see very much evidence of the wisdom dividend in our societies, but I mean, there is a wisdom dividend for society from people's expectation that they're going to live 80 years as opposed to 40, and they make life investments and in themselves, in their society, their families, that they wouldn't otherwise make. If you think you're going to kick it at 35, why go to college? Why have kids? Why do any of that stuff? But if you think you're going to be around 100 years, maybe the environment, maybe that global flooding that you've been warned about makes more sense.
Yeah, I mean, I guess for the sake of your argument, you really should hope that it is true.
Yeah.
Because and the fact that it isn't true in politics, by the way, doesn't mean that it's not true in interpersonal context. So that our older political leaders haven't been necessarily delivering the goods doesn't mean that older people and families aren't delivering the goods. If they aren't delivering the goods anywhere, which I doubt, then the grounds for the policy argument of putting so much money and resources into life extension become a little weaker.
I guess so. I mean, I don't know what the relationship is between age and wisdom at the collective level, but at the individual level, there is substantial evidence that people are happier because they have life experiences that give them context for things. But whether that makes them less afraid of immigrants in an irrational way, I don't know.
Yeah, I guess part of what I was thinking about, even if one abstracts from politics, is whether it makes them more valuable for their families.
As advisors.
As advisors, yeah. In more traditional societies, it does. I don't know about ours.
Well, this gets back to Margaret Mead. She's the one who invented the term generation gap, on the grounds that around the world, as things change more quickly, you have less and less to learn from your parents. And I think that's probably going to be true, too. You know, it's the gap between the 13-year-old who knows the latest tech and the 16-year-old who's already out of date. We're probably going to see that kind of thing.
Nobody can learn anything from anybody.
Right.
So another objection that actually really rubs me the wrong way to life extension is that a long life would become inevitably boring.
Yeah.
There's just not enough to interest, provoke, and attract if you live to 200. So I think that's bullshit. I think that's complete bullshit.
What really turned my mind around this was, it wasn't hard to convince me, but there's a science fiction author named Brian Stableford, and he wrote a series of novels in his immortality universe, which is basically everybody gets to choose when they die. They get the unlimited life expectancy. And one of the protagonists in his novels is a guy who sets himself the project to write a definitive encyclopedia of death. And it's going to take him 1,000 years. And each book of this encyclopedia will be one century project. That's the kind of projects that for me, I've wanted to learn Chinese since I first got to college. I took one year of it and gave up. But I've always had it on my bucket list. It would take me at least 5-10 years to learn Chinese, and I would love to have that opportunity. But now I'm also interested in Thailand and Japan and all these other places. So it would take me a lot longer to master all those languages. I have life projects that would keep me engaged well into my 200s. The only reason people don't think about this is because of sour grapes. They think, I can't live past 80, so I will not want anything that would bring me suffering past 80, right?
Right. So on the one hand, if you lose interest, it doesn't mean that everybody else loses interest, and it's not clear why public policy should sort of be made simply taking into account the positions of the people who are becoming bored. There's a good chance that they're becoming bored because of depression. Either way, one should not be taxed because somebody else, as it were, is getting bored. I think that's one, straightforward argument here. I actually recently heard that argument in a podcast. I forget the podcaster. But I think to me, part of, I've just been reading C.S. Lewis's book on mourning, A Grief Observed. And, his story was that he was alone for much of his life, fell in love with this woman as she was already essentially dying of cancer, and they had, a brief period of happiness, unimaginable happiness, as he reports it, and then she passed away. And they both had, so much plans each separately, and together. And so for C.S. Lewis and his wife, happiness, because of a series of external circumstances, starts late in life, right? Same was true about, John Stuart Mill and his wife Harriet, and then she died right away. And so this idea of boredom presupposes a pretty successful upper middle class life wherein everything went fine since you were 18, and maybe by the time you're 85, you're like, all right, shit, enough, I've had a good run. But what if your good run starts when you're 80 or when you're 60 or when you're 50, right?
It's parallel to the question about whether utopia is going to be boring, if we fix all these things. And my position has always been, and this is partly Buddhism, I guess, that just existing is going to, and wanting anything in your life is going to make you miserable at some point. So there's always going to be unrequited love. There's always going to be things you can't possess, projects you can't complete. If it's not that everyone around you is dying at the age of 3, that might be easily adaptable. You transfer your anxieties about everybody dying to all these other things. And I think that's what we've seen. We're in a post-materialist society. Most people are not struggling as hard as they used to for their daily bread. I mean, there's still a lot of struggle, but the less the people struggle for their daily bread, the more they care about other things, and they get unhappy about those things as well.
I mean, I guess I'd say, at least in the West, you can imagine a post-materialist society. Would be my correction to that. This one's a popular one. What do you think about this one, Jay? That you would have a population explosion if these technologies came online, and there would simply not be enough resources for it.
The evidence that global population was going to eventually decline started to emerge at least 20 years ago. All of the estimates of population growth, fertility, they were usually pegged at 2. It's like, it's going to decline with all these measures that people are taking and female education, but it's going to decline to 2. And then everyone's going to stay at 2. Guess what? They didn't stay at 2. Population is going to decline after about 2050 in the world as a whole. And it's declining already in places like Japan, China, Korea, Italy. So I don't think population control has the same argument as for sustainability that it used to. Now, if you think that there should only be 1 million people on the planet, then yeah, we got a long ways to go. But for me, the lesson of the Malthus, the rejection of Malthus over the last 400 years is that the sustainability of our population is determined by the sustainability of our technology, not by how many people we have. We have way more people than Malthus thought we would ever have, and they're not starving, at least not all of them, because we improved agricultural technologies. And we will improve other technologies that will increase our sustainability and reduce our resource use, as we already have.
So, but I mean, this goes back to what we were talking about earlier. Is this an attractive picture then, though? You'd have a lot more older people staying alive, a lot fewer younger people being born, young parents who are considering having babies, asking themselves, do they want to bring kids into the world in which they invariably will be sort of at the service of sustaining the growing older population? It seems like you'd have a perfect storm of having an increasingly old world.
Well, I have written already about this, the argument for pronatalism on the grounds that the slower we age as societies, the better we will be. The easier the transition will be. I think youth resentment at the fiscal burdens of the old age dependency ratio, as the demographers call it, how many old people need to be supported for every young person who's paying into the social support system, that is shifting dramatically around the world. And I think in China, it's going to be like 1-to-1 by 2050. In Japan, that's unsustainable. And young people are rightly going to be annoyed at every increase in Social Security benefits or senior costs. Again, this goes back to longevity dividend. You could sell them on the idea that, well, if you keep all these seniors healthy, they'll be a lot cheaper. But there's still going to be political and social tension around that. I understand that, yeah.
Yeah, it's actually interesting because that's going to happen just as, because of technologies that expand the quantity and quality of life, potentially old people will become less and less resentful of the young. So the kind of, Pink Floyd's The Wall and, the Smiths' Jealous of Youth kind of themes that, you and I grew up on, the old people jealous of the vigor of the younger, that's going to become less significant. in the world that you're kind of describing. And on the other hand, young people resentful at the older is going to become more significant.
I have been an advocate also for UBI for a very long time. And one reason I think it's going to be an important policy is that it's a lot more equitable to say to everyone at every age that you can have this kind of fiscal support and do what you want with it. If it is pitched as a zero sum between seniors and UBI, then it's going to be a very hard fight. But it's hard to imagine Social Security, for instance, being pushed into a UBI in the United States. But I think the universality of programs establishes a kind of social cohesion that means testing doesn't. The reason that Medicaid is so underfunded and under threat all the time is because its constituency is so weak. It's poor people. And what we need is universal health care that everyone has a stake in. What we need is universal basic income that everyone has a stake in. And that would ameliorate some of these generational conflicts.
Yeah, I guess I'm talking about a more existential, psychological set of features that was taken to be part of the human condition, as it were, that old people, as their capabilities declined, would look at the sort of young in their prime and then the flowering of their ability and sort of be jealous of that, bursting of abilities, etc. And, the consolation for that seemed to be that they could impart some wisdom, and B, that, they wouldn't have the suffering long, et cetera, et cetera. That's changing, potentially. I think that's actually a pretty fascinating change. And it's one of those cases where something that you thought was mutable is actually mutable and contingent.
One of the tropes of dystopian science fiction is growing young people and then scooping their brains out and putting your old brain into their young bodies into your clone.
That's the trope of vampire movies as well.
Right, exactly.
Yeah.
In a way, retirees are parasitic on the young. Do we resent the young? I guess I do. I would love to look like a 19-year-old, Twinkie boy again. But
sure. Well, soon you will if you get your way. So just wait around.
Maybe that's where VR comes into the picture. We all just wear VR glasses that make us look the way we want.
So here's what I take to be actually the most serious objection from the standard objections. And it's this, and it's a point that, you've raised in some of our preliminary conversations about this. Don't talk to me about all this age extension stuff being unnatural. In the beginning of the 20th century, it was natural to die at 40, and now it's about 80. And so we've doubled more or less the lifespan in the course of the century. So 80 isn't any more natural than 40. Why shouldn't we keep working on it, right?
Yeah, I'll caveat that life expectancy after the age of 5 is less dramatic an improvement. Life expectancy at the turn of the century after 5 was something like 60, and now it's 80. So
yeah, that's a good point. Be that as it may, so I think that's a strong point and argument against the fetishizing of what's natural sort of argument. These things are not natural in the first place.
Natural is not a moral category.
Natural broadly, it can be, but in this case, it's certainly not a moral category. It's a contested moral category at the very least. But, the problem with that argument, which I think is a good argument, is that there's technological acceleration. So it took a century to double the lifespan and move it from 40 to 80. And in the course of that slow development, we learned a lot of things and were able to kind of on the fly deal with some of the unintended, unforeseen consequences. But in the world that you're describing, there's going to be an acceleration of life extension technologies, and we might get them a little bit like the trajectory of growth in AI very, very quickly. Mm-hmm. And so what happens if in the next 10 years we move the life expectancy from 80 to 95? How ready are we for it? And are we sort of able to deal with it the same way that we did in the course of the 20th century?
Well, we've already talked about some of the social policy adaptations that we might want to make. We did extend the life expectancy over the last century so that people had to wait longer to inherit from their parents and things like that, and wait longer for jobs. Those things will all be true in this new scenario as well. And I would say in terms of how to think about these scenarios, biogerontologists are in general pretty sure that there's an upper limit on natural biological longevity of about 120, something like that. And so if we just estimated like a 50% increase in hopefully healthy life expectancy to like 120, which would take 50, 60 years probably of the diffusion of technology and the adoption of technologies to get average life expectancy up into that range. At the same time, people are not having babies, and the population rate is declining. So you could imagine that this comes in at a soft landing of a kind of a steady state. We just get older and we maintain the same number of people in our societies. We have fewer kids and we live longer. 120 would do that for the rest of the century. After, maybe 2050, then we get the technologies that, like uploading, that would really challenge things. And then we'd really have to think about the natural and the unnatural and all those other questions.
Yeah. It's funny that the biogerontologists settled on the biblical number of 120.
I thought it was 900. Wasn't Methuselah 900?
Well, Methuselah is not the standard.
He's not indicative.
No. The standard is, and Jews even wish this for each other on their birthdays, etc. May you live till 120. So that's kind of been the traditional one for a long time.
I'll tell you the metric that the transhumanists are fond of is called the longevity escape velocity. So right now, every year, we have been adding about 0.2 years of life expectancy to the average life expectancy of society. It's different in different countries, but it's less than 1. When it gets up to 1, if the accelerating technologies that you're thinking of, and Ray Kurzweil in his latest book, The Singularity is Nearer, he's a strong advocate for the notion that artificial intelligence and other things are going to help us live a lot longer very quickly. So if we got up to that quickly, and we started adding 1 year of life expectancy for every year, that would mean that life expectancy itself is no longer meaningful, right? And the British Actuary Society, like a decade ago, started thinking about this. What are we going to do if people start living, if life expectancy becomes meaningless? So I don't know how long it's going to take. We've actually gotten less progress in the United States because of deaths of despair and obesity and other problems. And so, again, things like Ozempic might pick that rate of progress back up. But we're still at like 0.2. So it's going to take a while for us to get to true escape velocity.
Yeah. So I guess this escape velocity business, in the end, is our both narrow and wide zone of disagreement. Because I think underneath it all, that's your regulative ideal, escaping death, essentially, suggesting that death itself is a mistaken category and just a sort of broad name for a range of reversible conditions that we can technologically conquer. And I guess for me, in trying to find the non-sort of cliche way of saying it, but for me it is part of the human condition that endows whatever we do with a sense of urgency, meaning, importance, that, like all transhumanists since Descartes, you want to do away with fragility and you want to do away with contingency and stuff that's outside of our control. And I think they're valuable.
I would say, as a Buddhist, I've always emphasized that finitude is not escapable, right? There is always finitude, even if it's the heat death of the universe. But much more...
that's not human finitude.
Well, if you believe in
the heat death of the universe, fuck that. That's in a long time.
I know people who would like to survive to the heat death of the universe. Let's just put it that way. And what I say to them...
But you don't?
What I say to them is, look, in the first place, you don't exist. And you may be able to ignore it when you're sitting around in this body. But as you start to do all these crazy things to yourself, copy yourself into multiple platforms, start editing your memories, enhancing yourself with artificial intelligence, the whole question of who you are and what it means for you to survive will become rather meaningless because, it's just a whole different ballgame. So I think there's both the constant change in our person that we will confront as we adopt these neurotechnologies and the longer we live. And then there's the inevitable finitude of life, even beyond that. Another example of finitude of life is if you just take the rate of death from accident in our societies and you extrapolate just that over time, you won't live past 1,000 years. You're probably be dead by 500 or something like that. Then you add war, plague, asteroids, volcanoes, all the other things that could happen, and most people are going to die at some point.
Although this goes back to your earlier point about the Gattaca problem. If we can completely manipulate the brain, we can probably figure out a way of significantly decreasing the chances that a brick would fall down on your brain, or getting into a car accident, etc. So we would be hitting those things as well. I don't think you can extrapolate those into the future if you're thinking about the technologically enabled
now you're thinking
future.
like a good transhumanist. Yes, if I have a daily backup, all I lost was those last 12 hours when I get hit by a bus. So.
Yeah. Well, I think to defeat a good transhumanist, you need to think like a good transhumanist. but I do. You're giving me the Buddhist escape velocity argument, which I appreciate, but you do seem committed to replacing death as we think about it today with everybody choosing when they would go out, which means that you, by and large, wouldn't go out involuntarily, right? That does seem like an elimination of the traditional our traditional existing idea of death as a sort of uncontrolled boundary.
I do not believe that life is ennobled by the prospect of involuntary death. I think everyone should think about the fact that death is probably inevitable at some point. And I think that will always be true as well.
I don't know about ennobled, but I think broadly life is, and this has always been in some way fundamentally at issue between us. I do think that life is made more meaningful by elements that are outside of your control, and that there's a degree of acceptance that we should practice towards that, and you want to minimize those.
As they have already been minimized. So part of the argument here is the status quo argument. We've already extended life expectancy. Most people don't want to go back. Why would it be bad to go forward?
Yeah, the question is about acceptance of finitude of death as a kind of, not when the heat death of the universe comes, but as a kind of final set of circumstances that's beyond your control, and what the scientific project is. And I hear that your scientific project in the end is eliminating that. One of your colleagues, Greg Stock, which I don't know what you do and don't agree with him about, like famously sort of announces at a conference, death to death, right? And I don't like that. I think Greg Stock, by doing that, actually is emptying out a reservoir that gives our life meaning. And that makes us more modest.
Death to death is another way of saying immortality. And I think immortality gives people the heebie-jeebies, partly because it sounds involuntary. And, I don't think anybody wants to be involuntarily alive forever. And it's also impossible for the reasons I've already attested. But yes, I don't like the phrase death to death or that as a goal. I like the idea of voluntary death, life extension, anti-aging, those kinds of things.
Yeah. In some ways, my sense is that this is, as you know, a kind of insight that I take from Burke, with whom I agree about some stuff and disagree about other stuff. But the very fact that some institutions are hoisted on you is not only an affront, but also a source of the meaning of those institutions. So, in religion, one can find some example of this kind of dynamic that, on the one hand, some of the Abrahamic religions in their traditional form are austere and terrible and problematic, in an attempt to adapt them to modern life. Liberal versions of them have picked and chosen only certain elements of them. So you have sort of all kinds of watered down, decaffeinated liturgies and practices, etc., so that they are adaptable, so that they're subject to choice, etc., etc. On the one hand, that's more decent and easier to live with, and on the other hand, I think in the process, the institution loses part of its majesty, part of its psychological power, part of its ability to attract. I think the same probably with changes applies to life.
Well, this is the nub of the philosophical debate, because it also applies, for instance, to jobs. Will it be good for people to not have to necessarily work for a living, to not necessarily have other social ills? And if you think that the diminution of social ills, the way I would put it is the way Marx put it, the moving from the realm of necessity to the realm of freedom. We're never going to be totally free, because that concept doesn't even make sense. There's no way in which you being bounded in a society are totally free.
Yeah, I guess I think that's a false dichotomy.
Necessity and freedom?
Necessity. Yeah, but that's why I'm not a
Marxist. Well, don't you think it's better to have a society where you get to choose your occupation?
To some extent, choose some parts of it. But I think part of what makes life meaningful are parts of your daily occupation, parts of your institutional affiliation, parts of your physical condition being hoisted on, and that you don't get to choose all of it. Like life is in Starbucks.
I think the Millsian ideal of self-realization is what I want in the context of an abundant society with a strong social welfare state, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, and long lives.
Yeah.
And I think that is the society in which we're most free. I'll just make a parenthetical observation that the emergence of the feminist movement had a lot to do with the decline of childbirth and the lengthening of women's lives. They had longer to be suffragist activists and pissed off about patriarchy. So I think there are a lot of ways in which us having more freedom in our lives will have benefits. Now, there will also be downsides. We'll spend more time scrolling social media or whatever, or watching TV. But I think it's better for people to watch TV than to be dead.
Yeah. I guess I think self-realization and self-design are only good and meaningful against a background that is fixed and not subject to your design. Because otherwise you have a sort of whirling picture.
Which is always going to be the case, right? There will always be constraints. You imagine a post-scarcity society, but there's only so much beach to be had, right? And so not everybody can have some beach.
Yeah, but your project is eliminating as many of the constraints as possible, and mine isn't. Yeah, I mean, I think that's...
What's your project?
Giving a fair hearing to the possibility that some of those constraints are what makes your life meaningful. And
so
that
validating our
ambivalence
chains. Sisyphus loving his rock.
Validating some of our chains. Growing some plants on the rock.
I'm glad we arrived at this formula, because I'm pretty sure which slogan's going to win. Validate your chains! Oh, let's be free.
No, I will go down well appointed and well dressed with the Titanic.
I mean, as we've noted, it connects to other questions. It connects to Michael Sandel's argument for the unbidden, right? That you should accept whatever the genetic roll of the dice gives you.
Well, not whatever, but that there's risks in complete genetic self-design. So maybe this point in which I'm sinking with the Titanic and you're waving at me with relief and
There's
glee
room on this
is a good
door, man. Come on in.
No. Play the violins.
Well, we are in the age of fascist oligarchy, and so it's hard to escape news about fascist oligarchy, especially when some of them are making technology.
No fascist oligarchy escape
That's
velocity.
right, not yet. So the news this week in fascist oligarchy: Zuckerberg removes fact-checking from Facebook, bending the knee to the conservative complaints about fact-checking there. Bezos is banning criticism of Trump and Musk, or at least he's pushed out a cartoonist who wanted to make an anti-Trump Musk cartoon, and there is a general sense that he is
in the Washington Post.
That he's been, he gave $100 million. He and all the other oligarchs gave $100 million to Trump's inauguration as part of their, kiss up.
So let's stay with the Facebook thing for a minute. So both on Facebook Threads and Instagram, what Meta and Zuckerberg have done is to remove fact-checking from false posts, right? And replace them with something similar to what's been going on Twitter or X, which is community posts. Namely, if there's a false post, then the community members will flag it, but there will not be any more third-party objective fact-checking as Meta used to have.
As Colbert notes, reality has a liberal bias. So if you go around saying, oh, actually, this election wasn't stolen, or actually hydrochloroquine doesn't cure COVID, and someone checks you on that, that's political censorship. So that's where we're at. Yeah.
Yeah. So this is straight up brown-nosing to the Trump administration. Hard to see it as something less than craven cowardice. What is interesting here is that empirically there have been studies that have shown that third-party fact-checking or objective fact-checking on social media reduce the amount of sharing false information and misinformation. So it actually did. It's one of those cases where something that is work is being removed for purely political reason, because it actually did do what it was.
There still are community notes on the site formerly known as Twitter, and they actually have the Grok built into Twitter now. And if you ask Grok, is Elon Musk a fascist and how, it will give you a long discourse on the many ways in which Elon Musk is supporting fascism. So I have hope that AIs will escape the bounds of their oligarchic masters and tell us the truth about the political world. It would certainly probably not cast good light on hydrochloroquine and these other fake remedies.
There you go. So talking about AIs escaping the bounds of their oligarchic masters, you pointed out that there was some news on the AGI front this week.
Well, people are abuzz about Sam Altman's latest prognostications about what they're seeing at OpenAI is headed. They're testing these O3 models of reasoning, where they're building a bunch of reasoning steps before it gives you an answer, which used to be the problem of hallucination and inconsistency and things like that. But now they're saying they're having it check itself and think itself. They're also using training data. They're pitting AIs against each other to train each other. And they're creating synthetic training data that is apparently getting past the data problem. And so Sam Altman has recently pronounced that they are at or close to artificial general intelligence in the O3 models at OpenAI, which means a human level of common sense and reasoning in daily affairs, not to mention having a PhD level knowledge of almost everything. And then the next step that he says that they're now targeting and have moved up their deadlines for is artificial superintelligence, which would be smarter than that, whatever that means. So I think people who pay attention are excited. People who don't like AI are still saying it's a bunch of hype and it's not going to go anywhere, or it's only going to have limited utility. But what they imagine is that AGI would have broad utility in replacing knowledge work in our society.
Yeah, so this mainly seems to suggest that the timeline potentially has become shorter.
And as a consequence, what people call the P-doom has become bigger. P-doom is the percentage that AI scientists give to AI destroying us all. So Jeffrey Hinton recently boosted his P-doom from like 5% to 20%. So
yeah. And this goes to something that we've been something that we discussed in our talk just now about life extension, which is the relationship between the intensity of a new discovery and the time that it takes it to come online. And that's an interesting matrix there. If you got artificial general intelligence over a period of 150 years, you would have time to learn from its mistakes. But
there's a famous chart of like the steam engine, radio, the telegraph, radio, television, the cell phone, etc., and the time it took for like most of the population to adopt that technology. And those curves have gotten steeper and steeper. OpenAI was like, 1 month, there was already 40 million users around the world. So it may be that yeah, we're in this acceleration of technological diffusion that will make it easier. But on the other hand, think about the fact that they're already talking about having to build 50 new data centers and 50 new nuclear power plants. Sam Altman, to his credit, hopes it will be fusion, which would be a lot cleaner than nuclear. But so, how long it would take to build a nuclear power plant in the United States, maybe under the fascist oligarchy, it would take days. We'll see. China seems to build them pretty quick. But currently, it takes a very long time to build a nuclear power plant. So if we were going to scale this up in the way that they imagine, it might take quite a long time.
Nuclear power plant, just to make it clear to our listeners, to provide the amount of energy needed for the large language models to operate. Apropos nuclear power plants, the pace of change here does lend some credence to the nuclear AI analogy that many of the AI people like to make. In 1938, 1939, as World War II starts, the air forces still, around Europe look a little bit like they did in World War I. And by the time the war is over, you have operable nuclear weapons. So there was a remarkable acceleration of military technology and the nuclear technology in those 6 to 7 years, and didn't end up so well. And indeed, we didn't have enough time to sort of figure out how to make that technology work.
There is a substantial part of the AI community who thinks that we are going too fast, who despair at OpenAI's knuckling under to the profit motive when they were founded as people who were very concerned about hard takeoffs. And now they're championing it as just another business innovation that everyone's going to love. And maybe they're right. But I think if you take the risks, like nuclear military risks, seriously, I'll just give you an example. Ray Kurzweil once said that we would know the singularity was here if we opened our inbox and there were a million spam messages in there. I've started getting spam from attractive young women from all around the world. All of them have postgraduate degrees on academia.edu. So someone has figured out how to, at scale, I've gotten 10 of these in the last 2 weeks. At scale, they all say, "Dear James, I really loved your recent paper about X, Y, and Z, and I would love to correspond with you about it." And then it's just a phishing scam. So there are going to be, from those kinds of examples all the way to the military, all kinds of problems. I know that the U.S. and China both take very seriously the possibility of AI changing the geostrategic balance. We see Ukraine becoming an innovator in automated drones that they're sending against Russia, and Russia's trying to do the same. We should talk about the military applications because they're there already.
Yeah. So again, to draw a connection, it seems like the unsustainable acceleration of AI in some important way is a condition for the success of some of the life extension technologies that we were talking about. Those two, they're hard to separate from each other.
I think they can be separated. Like I just saw people trained a 5 billion parameter model on the genome. You treating the genome as if it was all the language texts that are fed into other LLMs, and coming up with a model that says, if you tweak this gene, it'll affect this gene over here. That could allow us to make new genetically targeted, bioplagues, I suppose. And those are one of the things that people worry about. But I don't see that as an immediate threat as putting Skynet in charge of nukes. Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, I have one last pitch for our listeners, and that is journal abstracts written by LLMs to summarize your papers are perceived as more authentic, clear, and compelling than those created solely by academics. So everybody go out there, run your papers through an LLM and have it write your abstract, and people will love it.
Oh, that makes me even more self-satisfied as an academic.
Good talking to you, man.
All right, man. See ya.